Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
It's normal to be released with conditions. Well, in this case, the condition was not merely, go be good and don't disturb the peace and all that. It was more specifically, don't hold church. And so, of course, the trouble with that is, Pastor Coates is a pastor, and he obviously has very strong beliefs about being a pastor and holding church and ministering to his flock. So he could not in good conscience agree with that condition. Well, if you don't agree with the condition of your release, you cannot be released. So he is in jail.
Today I want to bring you an update to the case of Pastor James Coates of GraceLife Church west of Edmonton, Alberta, in Spruce Grove, in fact. Now, GraceLife has been the site of ongoing Christian resistance to the medical tyranny of the public health orders that restrict public gatherings, including our religious services. You see, in Alberta, religious services are limited to just 15% of the church's capacity. All this to stop the spread of COVID case counts, even though these case counts have plummeted drastically, and hospitalizations are down to less than half of what they were a month ago. All this without vaccines. When GraceLife Church refused to turn away congregants to meet that arbitrary 15% of capacity rule, and when the church did not force its congregants to wear masks during service, the church was put under weekly surveillance by local police and Alberta Health Services inspectors. Pastor James Coates received a $1,200 fine for violating the public health order. And then eventually, when Pastor James continued to defy that 15% restriction, an executive order from the Chief Medical Officer of Health to close the church was issued. Now, that piece of paper meant nothing to a congregation and a pastor that are compelled by their faith to gather together to worship every single week. And so they've continued. Now, 2 Sundays ago, Pastor James was arrested in his office for holding services. He was released, and the following Sunday, he again held service while local RCMP waited outside. However, the police did not arrest Pastor James again last Sunday. Instead, they asked him to come and turn himself in on the following business day. Now, Rebel News had an exclusive interview with Pastor James Coates after his sermon this past Sunday, something he has not granted to the mainstream media. And let me just say, I'm grateful for his trust, and I appreciate the trust of his congregation to be able to tell their side of the story accurately. As I reported then in a previous video, Pastor James Coates is currently in jail. He turned himself in on Tuesday morning in obedience to God and in resistance to tyranny. And that's where Pastor James remains. As I'm filming this, it's Thursday. So Pastor James is on his 3rd day of remand into custody of the Alberta provincial government for the crime of holding Christian worship, offering service to a willing and grateful congregation, and might I add, a growing congregation, because his pews have never been fuller. Pastor James is not being released because he will not comply with the conditions that will be placed on him for him to be released to the public. The conditions of his release are that he not say service again this Sunday. And so he cannot, in good conscience, agree to that. So at this point, Pastor James is being held indefinitely until his case winds through the system. He's in Edmonton's Remand Center, and as a rule, the Remand Center is a maximum security facility that holds the worst of the worst. Those who are not granted bail because they are just too dangerous or too much of a flight risk to be free awaiting trial. That's where Pastor James is right now as a political prisoner. Now, yesterday afternoon, right after we received word that Pastor James would not be receiving bail because he would not comply with the conditions of his bail, I had an exclusive, hasty interview with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom's lawyer who is representing Pastor James Coates. The lawyer's name is James Kitchen, and he is a passionate believer in civil liberties and religious freedom, and he is working very hard to help Pastor James Coates. Take a listen. James, can you please give us an update to what has been happening with Pastor James Coates? So last information that I had, he had turned himself in and was ready to take whatever the court decided they needed to throw at him. What has happened to Pastor James Coates?
So there was a bail hearing last evening. That would have been Tuesday evening, February 16th. It lasted for quite a while. The Crown prosecutor asked the court that he be detained, held in custody in jail, until such time as his trial, which of course we don't have a date yet for that, so it could have been a while. Obviously, I asked for his release. There's no justification to keep him. He's a peaceful, lawful citizen. He's a Christian minister, right? It would be a travesty. It'd be a stain on the administration of justice to be putting a pastor in church for holding jail in a country that purports to be free. So, I asked for that, and the justice of the peace, who heard the bail hearing, decided that it was not justified to keep him in jail. So, essentially agreed with the defense on that. So that's fairly normal. Where the wrinkles started to come in is, of course, that the justice of the peace decided that he should not be released without any conditions, which is what I asked for. But it's normal to be released with conditions. Well, in this case, the condition was not merely, go be good and don't disturb the peace and all that. It was more specifically, don't hold church. And so, of course, the trouble with that is, Pastor Coates is a pastor, and he obviously has very strong beliefs about being a pastor and holding church and ministering to his flock. So he could not in good conscience agree with that condition. Well, if you don't agree with the condition of your release, you cannot be released. So he is in jail because he could not in good conscience agree to stop holding church as a pastor. So that's where we're at right now.
And so there's no release date in sight, I suppose, because you don't have a trial date.
Yeah, so at this point, there is an option to appeal the condition, and we are planning to do that. I don't have a hearing for that yet. That could potentially happen in the next week or two or three, hopefully sooner rather than later. And then, if that appeal is successful and that condition is removed, well, then he could be released unconditionally, right? So that could happen, and then he would be released. What could also happen, theoretically, is that he could change his mind and agree to the release and then be released, or agree to the condition. I don't anticipate that. That's really between him and his maker. He's a brave man, and to stay in jail of your own volition, essentially, is what's happening because of your principles and your beliefs. There's few of us that have that much principle and courage, so he's got my respect for that. The other thing, of course, is, we could have a trial here within 3, 4, 5 weeks. And then, that's if he was acquitted at trial, well, he'd obviously be released. In fact, he may be released after trial in any event because even if he was convicted, because most of the offenses for which he's charged don't carry a jail term, right? They're just public health offenses, which don't carry jail. They carry a huge fine potentially, but no jail time. So, there's a number of things that can happen. We just have to wait and see. I should mention another thing that could happen is at any time the Crown could decide to vary or remove that condition. The Crown has that discretion. So the Crown could change their mind and decide that he should be released unconditionally. I don't expect that to happen, but it could happen.
Of all the places in this country or in the Western world where a Christian pastor held as a political prisoner, because really that's what he is at this point, I never thought it would be in conservative Alberta. Can you please, if you have any insight, how is Pastor Coates' family holding up? And secondarily, how is his congregation holding up, and do they have plans for Sunday?
They don't have specific plans for Sunday that I'm aware of yet. I would expect, based on who they are and on past behavior, they're going to hold church in some fashion come Sunday. Is that going to look different than what it has? I don't know. It could. That's really up to them. I think that, history predicts the future. And if that's the case when it comes to the church, we're probably going to see this Sunday what we've seen in the past. But that's really up to them. As far as his family, he's obviously got a brave wife. I don't think he'd be there if he didn't have a brave wife standing behind him. I'm speaking from experience here because yeah. I got a brave wife that stands behind me, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if she wasn't there. So, I think she must be doing pretty good, or he wouldn't be doing this.
Now, maybe you can also give us a little insight into the best way that people could support GraceLife Church and Pastor Coates, because I know that people are, first of all, hungry for information, because I know the church has been sort of hands off when it comes to the mainstream media. They're not talking to them, and I'm very grateful that they allowed me to attend service this past Sunday. I appreciate the trust. But what are some of the ways that people could support him as he battles for religious freedom, and I guess support you at the Justice Center, because you folks are doing some great work on this issue as a whole, but in particular with Pastor Coates?
So I'll start with the Justice Center because that one's quick and easy.
Sure.
If you're somebody who supports our work and you got a few extra bucks, we'd appreciate them. We're a nonprofit charity. It's all tax deductible donations. That's where all of our money comes from. That's how I'm paid. I'm paid a salary. So that's how we roll. And it is a lot of people that don't know it, that they support us, but they don't actually know that that's how we run. And most of our donations are really small, actually. So that's the thing. I mean, of course, you can share our news releases and all that and get people aware. That's good too. When it comes to Pastor Coates, I think the biggest thing is people, if they support him, if they disagree with lockdowns, if they believe that their civil liberties should be preserved, they need to stop self-censoring, and they need to take the risks, and they need to speak out. Right? They need to go to the rallies or talk to their friends or reasonably and respectfully talk on social media. Whatever it is for them, that's the place where they could speak out and speak their mind and say, yeah, you know what, I want to stand up and be counted too, because this is wrong. And I'm going to say it is, even though, people might get mad at me, or I might get in trouble at work or whatever, right? The biggest problem we have right now is not that there aren't a fair amount of people that oppose lockdowns, is that they're not saying anything. Right, especially the people with actually the power or influence or position where if they said something, it would mean a lot more. Those are actually the ones the most scared, and that's really disheartening. That's what you can do. Stop self-censoring and voice your support, voice your opposition to the lockdown. That's what's going to bring this thing down. Is if people actually decide they've had enough, and they're going to exercise their legitimate democratic rights of saying, I don't consent to being governed this way, because democracy is governing by consent. Well, stop consenting to being governed by a dictatorship, a medical dictatorship that says you no longer have any rights.
I certainly hope that the Justice Minister, Casey Maydew, I hope his phone and his email is blowing up after today, because this is not anything that I expected from a justice ministry led by him.
Yeah. Well, and that's how it should be. That's how democracy functions if it survives, right? So I hope that is what happens.
James, I will let you get back to it. I know you just unplugged your phone to do an interview with me. I know this is probably one of the busiest days at work you've had in a very long time, so I appreciate you jumping on Skype with me to update us on the case of Pastor James Coates.
You're welcome.
Pastor James Coates is being held with murderers, rapists, gangsters, child abusers, wife beaters. I suppose the people amongst us who need Jesus the most, maybe he can help them. Pastor James is in a cramped cell as a political prisoner of conscience. Now, this is something that I can definitely see happening to Christians in some of the more authoritarian areas of the world, like the Middle East, when ISIS held territory in Iraq, or in Hong Kong right now as the communist Chinese state cracks down on civil liberties there and attempts to rewrite the Christian Bible to remove those important pieces of scripture where Christians are called to obey God, when obedience to the state means disobeying God's teaching. But I never thought that I would see this in Canada, where our Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects our God-given right to religious liberty. And I never thought that I would see this happening in Alberta, in what I truly believe is the most free and freedom-minded province in our great dominion. And I never thought that I would see this happening under the leadership of Conservative Premier Jason Kenney and Justice Minister Casey Madu. In Alberta, we have released hundreds of actual convicted criminals from our jails and prisons because of the alleged threat of the coronavirus. And yet, this is the same legal system that is now putting a Christian pastor behind bars when his church is not responsible for one single coronavirus case, not even one. I know many of you are asking me what you can do to help Pastor James, and I think James Kitchen has the right idea. First, if you pray, pray. Secondarily, you need to start making phone calls, sending emails, and writing letters to your MLAs, to the ministers of the Crown, and to the Premier's office, and also to your own churches, asking them to stand up for what's right. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. If you're the pastor of a church or a small business owner and you are willing to defy the lockdown restrictions, if you feel called or inspired by what Pastor James Coates is doing to do the same and open up in defiance of the lockdown measures, reach out to us at iwillopen.com and let us tell your story.